Croatia's declaration of independence has been met with a bloody attack.
Coming in from Croatia, the Yugoslav army tanks are rolling out of their barracks.
The international community is left to wonder, can Yugoslavia resolve this crisis?
As the battle escalates, it is now apparent the Yugoslav army is siding with the Serbs.
The fallen town of Vukovar is the scene of many atrocities. Bodies are everywhere.
Le forze delle Nazioni Unite presenti sul territorio.
Croatia has asked for UN peacekeepers to stop the fighting.
A massacre in a village near the port town of Zadar.
And now the war in the former Yugoslavia has spread to Bosnia.
The world just watches as Serb forces trample Bosnia's Muslim population.
The United Nations is forming an international crime tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Although peacekeepers have arrived in Bosnia, the war still rages on.
Nothing short of genocide in Srebrenica.
Who refused to be named said, quite simply, the UN has failed. Nothing short of genocide in Srebrenica.
The Croatian army has launched what they are calling Operation Storm.
Serb-occupied territory has been liberated in Croatia.
Truppe croate si sono ripresi.
Croatians are hailing Ante Gotovina as a hero for leading Operation Storm.
Sehen Ante Gotovina als Held für sein.
The Dayton Peace Accords signal an end to the war.
Crimes committed during the aftermath of Operation Storm have led.
It was announced today that Croatian General Ante Gotovina has been indicted by the ICTY for command responsibility of Operation Storm.
News of the indictment was met with massive protests in Croatia.
Ante Gotovina a été arrêté. After 4 years on the run, Ante Gotovina has been arrested in Tenerife.
He is charged with 7 counts of murder, persecution, and deportation. He is expected to plead not guilty to the charges.
The STY was formed in '93 exactly because the international community and mainly European states were concerned with this horrible conflict happening in the middle of Europe. I didn't realize it before I came here, how important it is. I saw many people who are grateful that they could have a place to tell about their suffering and to see people they believe are responsible for crimes facing justice.
It's clearly something that should enjoy the support of people who support human rights and people who want to see an end to impunity for war crimes. Unfortunately, the victims in the region don't feel that justice has been served. The theory can be noble, but in practice, you encounter many difficulties. And that's what I think happened with the War Crimes Tribunal in many cases.
The war in the former Yugoslavia was the scene of the most horrific crimes against humanity witnessed in Europe since World War II. With the conflict still raging, the United Nations responded by establishing the ICTY, an international crimes tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. However, critics charge that the UN is using the court as a political instrument to create a narrative that paints the conflict as a civil war instead of a war of aggression by Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic.
That's the basic problem with the ICTY today. It is a UN agency, and it suffers from all the weaknesses of the United Nations, of any United Nations agency. You know, I'm not against United Nations per se. I'm fully aware that there is a place for force like that today in the world, but United Nations has let down the basic principles, the principles that it was based on and the principles that it was established on, because they negotiated with the Serbs. At the time, these people were up to their necks in blood. That's what moral equivalency is, negotiating with the murderer.
The Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia comprised of 6 republics and 2 provinces, was established in 1946. In 1991, the country was ravaged by the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. The fall of communism throughout Europe enabled Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic to push for a much stronger Serb-dominated Yugoslavia. However, it was widely believed that Milosevic's real goal was to create a greater Serbian nation out of the ashes of the former Yugoslavia. His efforts were met with great resistance from the other republics, especially Croatia and Slovenia.
That was the main reason for the independence. Yugoslavia did not exist anymore. It was Serboslavia. It was becoming more and more Serboslavia.
On June 25, 1991, the new nations of Croatia and Slovenia declared independence from Yugoslavia.
On the beginning, we were really hoping that we're going to be able actually to get our independence without the war. There were a lot of peace rallies. There were a lot of songs about, stop the war in Croatia.
After Croatia and Slovenia declared independence in late June 91, the Yugoslav National Army, the JNA, marched into Slovenia and shortly afterwards Croatia.
Well, the war began because Milosevic wanted a war to stay in power.
One were the aggressors, the other defended their country, and of course the Serbs could use the weapons of the Yugoslavian army.
When you have a conflict inside such complex story, where the state is falling apart, I think it is a politicization to call one particular side as aggressor.
The UN's central failure came from the inability to point a finger to Belgrade and say, you're the problem, you're the aggressor, you're what started all of this. Instead, they declared that war in general was the problem, because war was there almost like a force of nature, like a typhoon hit the Balkans called war. Even when there's famine in the Horn of Africa, war requires someone starting it.
The war in the former Yugoslavia was the worst conflict in Europe since the Second World War. Although the suffering knew no boundaries, the question of whether it was a war of Serbian aggression or a civil war is hotly contested to this day.
The simple fact is, between 1991 and 1995, you had several 100,000 people killed. You had literally millions of people displaced, and the war was basically fought by Slobodan Milosevic in an effort to create a greater Serbia.
The fact that most of the war crimes were committed by Serbs during this war only reflects the fact that Serbs were best armed. It does not reflect any moral difference between Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and so on.
A major front in the war in Croatia was in the eastern border region. This area, known as the Krajina, contained a large ethnic Serb population, which attempted to annex to Serbia by creating their own republic, Republika Srpska Krajina.
How can you call Krajina Serbs aggressors? They lived there for centuries.
No, it's not confusing, it's very simple. It is the fact that Serbs lived in that territory for centuries and centuries. But it is the fact that at the beginning of war, they forced all Croats to leave those areas, and Croats lived at least as long as Serbs did.
So when we talk about Croatia, for example, very few people remember that when Serbs were creating Republika Srpska Krajina, about 200,000 of Croats were expelled from this region.
There was no civil war. There was aggression from the side of Serbia, very much with involvement of Yugoslav army, very much control from Belgrade, and Serbs, local Serbs, were simply used as almost to say pawns in that game.
Ovo smatramo samo kao opomenu, a u sljedećem susretu bit ćemo još žešći.
Morali bježati spavati po šumama, pa vidjeli ste čak gdje ona pokazala i po krmarima, po štalama, kako bi bili na sigurnijem mjestu.
A bojali smo se da dođu ovu noć k nama, šta mi znamo ko će doći, ko neće.
Ika Kardum lives in the Kanin region of Croatia, which was the scene of many atrocities and ethnic cleansing by Serb forces against local Croatians. However, near the end of the war and the aftermath of the Croatian military operation called Storm, many returning Croats committed crimes of revenge against Serbs. These crimes resulted in an ICTY indictment against Croatian general Ante Gotovina. Gotovina is to many the biggest modern-day hero in Croatia for leading Operation Storm, which in August of 1995 liberated Croatia after 4 years of Serb occupation. In one of the most high-profile cases at the court, ICTY prosecutors have set out to prove that he ordered or willfully ignored the murder, persecution, and deportation of Serbs from the region. If found guilty, Gotovina faces life in prison.
Enormous effort was done to destroy the property of the Serbs so they have nowhere to return. And this is the main point of our allegation.
Ja sam onda bio u Kninu, tako da je poviše Knina, baš eto. Poviše Knina, samo su nam rekli povlačimo se i ajte, doćete kući ne možete, samo su tako rekli. No?
Dakle, noć prije je moj sin došao iz bolnice sa autom i rekao mi je, tata, sprema se, nama je naređeno da se moramo evakuirati iz bolnice. Da li ti misliš ići? I mama. On je bio sav iza sebe, plakao i moli Boga i tako dalje. On se je rekao da je supruga da mi ne bi htjeli ići, da ćemo mi ostati tu.
It was an ethnic cleansing operation as they come. The message to the Serbs in Croatia was clear: we want you out. We don't want you back ever. And if you decide to stay, you're probably not going to last very long.
The so liberated territories were not put under effective control, and law and order were not established properly by military. That allowed people to come in and retaliate against the remaining Serbs.
ICTY regulations prohibited General Gotovina from being interviewed for this film.
It is really frustrating for us to see now that a person like General Gotovina is being accused, the guy who actually was one of the lead people during those operations in Croatia, who was conducting himself in a way that real soldier should.
Ante Gotovina je čisti heroj i ostaće heroj dok je god jednog Hrvata na Hrvatskoj domovini. I tvrdim i garantiram gledajući da sam njegov vojnik, da taj zločin nije napravio.
A war crimes indictment against Croatian General Ante Gotovina, a beloved figure in his homeland. News of the indictment was met with massive protest.
If the view of the ICTY is that they are not interested in who is the aggressor, but they're only interested in victims, then they seem to have misunderstood completely the reason why the ICTY was set up. This is meant to be about justice. The ICTY wouldn't have been set up if it wasn't about justice. But General Gotovina is being treated unjustly.
Ante Gotovina was raised in Pakistani, Croatia. Like many residents of the small Adriatic coastal town, Gotovina's family were poor fishermen.
Zajedno bi išli na ribu, lovili smo i ribu i radili fizički i svašta. Prvu ribu mi je Ante učio kako se lovi riba. Ante je već bio iskusan ribar.
Često je volio sa starim ljudima, ribarima, težacima, sisti, onako napustiti društvo. I onaj čovjek koji je uvijek volio avanturu, želio avanturu, puno čitati knjiga, počeli su dolaziti turisti, vidjelo se na koji način žive oni, na koji se način živilo tada u bivšoj Jugoslaviji.
Pa Gotovina je već kao dijete pokazivao ovako malo avanturističke neke crte i sanjario je vrlo često o tome kako će se otisnuti u bijeli svijet, kako će upoznati Ameriku.
Nismo imali slobodu ovdje i htjeli smo ići van. On je čak 2 puta pokušavao preko granice prijeći sa mojim bratićem, pa su jedan put ulovili na slovenskoj granici, ali tamo na talijanskoj, pa su ih vratili nazad. Jedan put su barkom preko mora tili pa je malo bilo vitra, pa nisu mogli.
At the age of 16, Gotovina got a job on a tanker ship and was finally able to see the world. 1 year later, while at port in Italy, Gotovina met a former member of the French Foreign Legion. Intrigued with the stories of adventure that he was told, he left the ship and went to Marseille to join the Legion. During his 15-year military career, Gotovina became a highly decorated officer in the Legion.
Ja kad bih morao definirati Gotovinu, ja bih rekao da je on i pjesnik, i vojnik, i slikar, i jedna vrlo kultivirana osoba. Pa i dosta ovako spretan u ophođenju sa ženama, dakle jedan vrhunski kavalir. Ali u njemu je stalno spavala jedna čudesna želja za znanjem, tako da on uvijek težio tome i da čita knjige, i da se druži s kultiviranim ljudima. To je radio već u Parizu, dolazio je u njihove salone, na njihove zabave, družio se sa malo profiliranijim, da tako kažem, ljudima.
Although he had stopped his military career, news of the impending war in his homeland caused Gotovina to reconsider his retirement.
When General Gotovina saw that this conflict had broken out, he realized that something bad was going on and decided to go back and return to Croatia.
Most of the citizens of Croatia realize that we are in the war and that we have somehow to defend ourselves.
Za vrijeme treninga su me došli ljudi iz vlasti i tražili su da ja i igrači dođemo u Hrvatsku vojsku. I mi smo otišli. Bez ikakve pripreme, bez ičega. Jer kako sam ja bio trener, znali su da imam autoritet, a onda su me automatski stavili za zapovjednika. Tako sam počeo.
By the summer of 1991, the Yugoslav National Army was virtually under Serb control. And although the Croatian army offered some resistance, it really had no hope of winning.
I cannot destroy a tank with this gun. And this is all I had.
I had my jeans on me and my old camouflage from Yugoslav army, you know, with just like a Croatian flag on it. The third day I remember we were there and it was like, you know, airplanes, you know, MiG-29s and G2s, G4s like bombing the city, and you're like, you know, it's like, you know, throwing like stones and then. So it was quite frustrating on the beginning.
The United Nations imposed an arms embargo that was enforced against all sides during the war. As the Serbs controlled nearly all the arms of the former Yugoslavian army, this was a much debated policy.
Imposing embargo was the idea to stop the fighting, not to fuel it more. If you allow everybody to buy arms, the conflict would be much more bloody and terrible.
Nobody did really defend the Serbs, but there was the idea they are all the same. It's, yes, Balkanic tribes, and it's ethnic conflict, and they are racist on both sides.
And the reason that we were emotionally disconnected from this conflict when it was happening was, you know, the Serbians and the Vulcans and the Romulans are fighting each other, and I don't have a scorecard, so I'm not going to care.
I think I could start up the peace conference in The Hague again. And it's not been worthwhile doing it now, because when they're killing each other, there's no way in which you could get people into the sort of mood in which you could compromise.
I think the major problem was really to understand what was going on. And if you don't understand what is going on, it's difficult to help people in the field. By being neutral, you are apparently by definition taking the side of the aggressor.
Neutrality in the face of murder is taking a side. There's no such thing as neutrality in the face of murder. You don't stand back and say, yeah, go ahead and kill her, I'm neutral. You're not neutral. You're facilitating a murder. And that's what the UN did.
By imposing an arms embargo on the whole of what had been the former Yugoslavia, the UN ensured that those who needed to resist were not able to do so. And that, of course, also encouraged the people who had the arms and the people who had the will to use them, namely Belgrade.
The Serbs did not get a signal from the international community that what they were doing in Croatia was not acceptable. The Serbs were allowed to continue virtually with impunity.
Do you think you can do something to stop this?
Of course we do something. Of course. We report everything what we see and what we experience.
So at least it looked as if things were being done, but in fact they weren't.
What do you think about ceasefire when the members of the EC monitoring mission has to hide in the shelters?
To that point, I have no comment.
In mid-September, there were a couple of very important meetings where the Council of Ministers decided that military intervention would not be contemplated.
So what we all decided to do was to meet again next week, and in the meantime monitor very carefully what's happening in the ceasefire.
And literally within a day, there were 100 and more Serb tanks moving from Belgrade into the Vukovar area.
The Croatian town of Vukovar was the first major battleground in the war. Not only did the Yugoslav army and Serb paramilitaries have a huge arms advantage, they also outnumbered the Croat soldiers by up to 20-1. The siege of Vukovar, which many predicted would be over in days, instead lasted for nearly 3 months. The entire city was destroyed, its civilians living below ground during the siege.
Mnogi ljudi su bili za neprepoznat u ta 3 mjeseca. Mnogi u 3 mjeseca nisu ni vidjeli ni sunca, ni mjeseca. Živjeli su u katakombama, živjeli su u jednim neljudskim uvjetima koji se ne mogu nazvati nikako drugačije nego borba za goli život. Vidio sam smrt, užas. Prijatelji su mi umirali na rukama. Svuda oko nas smrt, palež, jauci. Snalazili smo se.
Vukovar was totally, completely destroyed. Again, that is sometimes forgotten, but that's the fact. There was no one single house in Vukovar that was not destroyed.
It was one of the most beautiful cities of former Yugoslavia, with Baroque architecture and lots of different ethnic groups living in harmony. That was before the war, and now it's still a very unpleasant place to be.
Ovdje se ljudi nisu mjerili, niti se mjere po nacionalnosti, vjeri, po rasi. Živjeli su u ovom gradu u vrlo jednom tolerantnom, ja bih rekao vrlo dobrom odnosu, međutim, nažalost, dogodila se 91. godina.
Well, in Vukovar it was a really awful situation because the defenders didn't have anything to defend themselves. They had no weapons, and they were bombed each day during 3 months, and we saw it.
What was really striking about the aftermath of Vukovar was that it was done with international camera crews walking up and down the streets, and this was on European TV. These guys mocking the international community and boasting about what they just did in Vukovar.
On November 18, 1991, Vukovar fell. As the Croatian soldiers laid down their weapons and surrender, the town's residents filed out of Vukovar, many holding their worldly possessions in simple plastic grocery bags. Unfortunately, not everyone was allowed to get out safely. After the fall, many Serb soldiers entered Vukovar and committed atrocities, including a massacre at the hospital, where over 250 patients and hospital personnel were executed.
City surrendered in November of 1991, and then the army let the irregular units from Serbia, which really bad people, come into the city first and have their fun for 2 or 3 days.
They cut off their noses, they cut their throats, They killed the children, they raped the women, they attacked the churches, they put a Cyrillic graffiti over the buildings. You will find that it was one of the most shocking experiences that Europe has ever seen.
And I really think there was a societal hiccup in Europe where they couldn't believe that this is happening down the road. I mean, and the thing is, the Balkans are down the road from Austria, from Germany. And drunken militiamen with AK-47s are shooting old ladies and setting up rape camps for their daughters. And of course, the UN sent teams to go and investigate reports of a massacre of Vukovar, and they went, and sure enough, they said, yeah, there was a massacre.
What happened at Vukovar certainly persuaded all Croats of all political persuasions, even the most pacifist Croats, that they were going to have to fight for their survival.
After singing, Stop the War in Croatia for a couple of months and everything like that, you're like, look, nobody's going to give us a hand. We really do need to do this on our own.
They were quite unprepared, and it was quite clear later on when they realized that they had very few arms at hand to defend against Serb aggression.
The Croatian army in 1991 and 1992 was a ragtag group. Croatia did not have an army when it declared independence, did not have a proven officer corps, did not have a properly functioning chain of command, did not have experienced soldiers leading various units.
If it hadn't been for General Gotovina and the others who returned at the beginning of 1991 to build up an army for Croatia, Croatia would not have survived as an independent state.
When he returned to Croatia, General Gotovina took up arms just as a regular soldier, did not make a big emphasis of the fact that he had this experience as an officer in the Foreign Legion, and sort of proved himself on the battlefield.
Gotovina je počeo, on se prijavio u Hrvatsku vojsku kao običan vojnik, ali vrlo brzo se shvatilo da on raspolaže vrlo velikim vještinama vojnim ratnim i on je postao instruktor.
The newly formed nation of Croatia needed to form an army, but had very few soldiers with military experience. As a former elite commando in the French Foreign Legion, Gotovina had successfully completed some of the most strenuous training in the world, and thus he was charged with training and leading a group of soldiers into an elite unit with the discipline of a professional army.
Bio je jako zahtjevan fizički za proći, isto tako imao je neke segmente za razbijanje straha, što ja znam, skakanje sa nekih ljestava sa 5-6 metara i tako neke stvari. I to smo ponavljali.
Ti ga jednostavno moraš poštivati. Jer tak i on bio i prema nama, moralo se izvršavati sve, nije smilo faliti negdje.
Tomislav Čavar was on patrol deep in Serb-held territory when he was shot in an ambush. Čavar was badly injured and his unit had to carry him out, but this was made nearly impossible because they were surrounded by enemy fire.
Nisi mogu, on puca pola metra iznad zemlje, mi smo morali dole. Puzali su sa mnom, ljudi su baš satrali su se, vukući me, ali me nisu ostali. Ali eto, on je od nas to napravio i ekipa smo bili.
General Gotovina je imao jedan fantastičan autoritet i veliko znanje i hrabrost, tako da svi vojnici koji su bili pod njim su dobili tu hrabrost njegovu i dobili su jedno poštovanje prema njemu kao zapovjedniku. Puno manje ljudi u Hrvatskoj vojsci poginulo zbog tog njegovog iskustva i zbog tog jednog vojničkog držanja.
To ti je obitelj, ti je tu baš tako, pogotovo kad puca oko glave, ti isti ljudi oko tebe na prvom mjestu. I što je zakon bio kod njega, ranjenik nije smio ostati. Nema ostavljanja ljudi. I to je ono što te veže.
A month after Čavar was injured, Gotovina himself was shot in combat. Bullet entered one side of his thigh and exited through the other. Although he was bleeding profusely, Gotovina remained on the battlefield.
Kad sam došao do početnih položaja, našao sam generala Gotovinu kako stoji na oba dvije noge, oslanjajući se na dvije puške. Bio je ranjen
u predju bedra debelog mesa, stajao je na nogama i čekao da se i posljednji naš vojnik izvuče.
I tada se srušio jer je toliko krvario da su mu čizme bile pune krvi. I tako je on završio u bolnici.
On je osobno meni pričao da je sve svoje dokumente složio u jednu kovertu, spremio, ako pogine da se to pošalje obitelji.
On je rođen u jednoj težačkoj ribarskoj obitelji koja je teško živjela, koja je teško dolazila do sredstava za život. Majka mu je stradala kad je on imao 4-5 godina.
Kopale su se jame, crna jama i eksplozivom se pucalo u mjestu.
I u tom trenutku je on istrčao na ulicu i krenuo upravo prema tom mjestu gdje se to miniralo. I kad je to majka spazila, ona je skočila iz kuće, počela trčati, zgrabila ga, privinula ga uz prsa i praktički se bacila skupa s njim na pod, međutim, na zemlju, međutim nju je pogodio od mina jedan kamen u glavu, pala je u duboku komu i još istu noć umrla. On, kad je bio u legiji stranaca, on je uvijek zazivao na neki način svoju majku, koja je bila već tada mrtva, naravno i na nebu. On je vjerovao da je ona na nebu, on je vjerovao da ga ona štiti.
After retiring from the French Foreign Legion, Gotovina began working for a private security firm in France. According to some French media reports, this work involved him in underground criminal activities.
If there wasn't a war for former Yugoslavia, Ante Gotovina would remain a petty adventurist, and he, as a young man, he joined the French Foreign Legion, served there, and mostly did petty crime after that.
And actually what was not very much proclaimed in Croatia, he was 3 times charged for violent conduct, extortion, and different types of crimes in France.
Il y a 2 principales affaires. L'une, c'est le vol d'une bijouterie de la place Vendôme. Autre affaire, beaucoup plus confuse parce qu'elle n'a jamais été jugée, Ante Gotovina est impliqué dans un kidnapping où quelqu'un de fortuné, de riche, a été pris en otage.
Les responsables de ce vol ont été attrapés tout de suite et c'est eux qui, tardivement, ont mis en cause Ante Gotovina. Ce que l'on sait également, c'est que les personnes qui ont mis en cause Gotovina dans ces circonstances sont revenues totalement sur leur témoignage une fois qu'ils ont été mis en présence d'Ante Gotovina.
The fact that the prosecution discusses General Gotovina's history in France is incredibly revealing, and I think it shows the substantial weakness of their case.
Here was a man whose whole character and background was enough to give the international legal establishment a collective frisson. And they thought that this was an excellent target.
They are drudging up matters from the 80s for which I trust they have very little knowledge or information. And in essence, all this amounts to is defamation because it has absolutely zero relevance in a criminal trial in front of the Hague Tribunal.
Kad bi sve to tako bilo, kao što je prezentirano u medijima, da je Gotovina bio kriminalac, provalnik, ne znam što sve ne, onda sasvim sigurno ne bi 1994. godine on u vrlo tijesnoj suradnji sa francuskim ministarstvom obrane organizirao da na Šepurinama, prvoj velikom kampu za obučavanje hrvatskih vojnika, instruktori budu Francuzi.
Among the classes that were taught there at General Gotovina's insistence were classes on the Geneva Conventions and on the need to respect the international laws of war. Serb military counterparts speak very highly of General Gotovina and the fact that even though they were enemies, he was a very professional soldier who did not view people on the basis of their race or ethnicity.
International community said it was an interethnic conflict. That is a big lie. To say that is an interethnic conflict is unfair for the Serbs who fought Milosevic and for all the victims of this policy.
The fact is that many people were just mere victims of this policy and this propaganda, and I think that maybe it should be explained to Croats and Bosniaks and the others that many of those people were not aware. Second World War atrocities, and especially against Serbs in Croatia, were revived intentionally in order to create this atmosphere of fear where people reacted and were conditioned for the war with an idea to prevent new genocide.
As a Jew, I didn't want the memory of the Holocaust to be used as a tool to justify a massacre or an aggressive war, and that was the case.
I had many opportunities to meet with Mr. Milosevic. I consider him one of the clearly criminal mind. He would manipulate on all possible ways, and I don't have any doubts that he was capable in manipulating many of Serbs.
Da su neke stvari lagali. Oni su sad proglasili u ovom selu da ima 20-30 mrtvija da bi izvezali vojsku. I tako je bilo. Vojska krenula velike odmah. Oni su izvezali, a niko nije bio mrtav, sa nike strane.
The atmosphere was very nationalistic, and their speech was also reflected. You know, their television, their papers, the way they sort of treated Croats and how they talked about them. That is all true. But when we come to the killing, it was mostly carried out by paramilitary units, army and police.
One of the war's worst atrocities occurred in the fall of 1991, when Serb paramilitaries, supported by the Yugoslav army, invaded the village of Škabrnje, near the Croatian coastal town of Zadar. In that massacre, 25 Croatian prisoners of war and 61 mostly elderly civilians were killed.
When that happened in Škabrnja, we all thought they're going to just come into town and kill us. Everybody, they were closed that time, really.
They were literally on the outskirts of Zadar in Croatia and were able to shell Zadar on a regular basis.
Nismo mjesecima imali vode ovdje u gradu, nismo imali mjesecima svjetla električnog, struje.
Koliko puta ujutro smo se oprali ne iz špine, ne iz pipe, nego samo iz flaše. Malo vode na dlano I oprati se.
You hear sirens in the middle of the night, you have to take your kids and blankets to my neighbor's basement, and there's always like 30, 40 people, and with 2 little kids. That wasn't really life like for normal people.
Zadar was a strategically vital town during the war. Aside from having a port, the town is located in the center of Croatia's coast, and the Serbs would have been able to break Croatia in half if they took it. General Gotovina was assigned to defend Zadar with the scant resources the Croatian army possessed.
Nismo imali oružje, jednostavno imali smo šta smo od tog momenta imali, samo srce, hrabrost I moral. I Srbi to nisu znali šta mi imamo.
With the Serbian military on the doorstep of Zadar, General Gotovina devised a bluff that would keep them from entering the city.
Mi smo znali da neprijateljska strana ima jako dobre elektroničke obavještajce koji su u svakom trenutku snimali sve naše razgovore I tako neke stvari. I imali smo neku prešutnu, neotvorenu komunikaciju kako ih treba pustiti što više da uđu u Zadar, da ih onda poklopimo, da ih navučemo u jednu klopku.
I tako da je ta propaganda dosta utjecala na to da Srbi ne prilaze gradu.
While Gotovina and his troops held on against the much better armed Serbs, there was much angst in some Western nations about the UN arms embargo and whether they should abide by the resolution.
The arm embargo, of course, made things much worse. The international community should have done something when the siege of Vukovar occurred.
There's a lot of dissatisfaction with UN mandate. At the same time, it's undeniable that UN brought some kind of stability and some kind of normalcy including also humanitarian aid.
In the beginning of the war, in 1991, Serbia had a very clear military advantage. The military balance changed during these 3 years. Croatia managed to get modern weaponry, and the US actually helped Croatia bust the embargo.
Much was talked about it later on as violating the UN resolution, but it was a very immoral resolution which affected the victims.
As the Croatian army became better armed, General Gotovina was able to mount an offensive attack that pushed Serb forces away from Zadar. It was the Croats' first major battlefield victory in the war.
I think there were several very important moments in the war, but certainly one of very important moment was when they were prevented to take Zadar. That was first time when the role of General Gotovina was particularly important. If they succeed with that, God knows how history would look.
If the Serbs had taken Zadar, and they would have achieved what was really necessary in order to destroy Croatia as a viable state. It wasn't just a matter of giving them a port, it was a matter of actually breaking Croatia in two, and thus, I think, breaking Croatia's will to survive as an independent state.
Well, what has happened this morning is rather unfortunate, because this is the sort of thing we've been trying to head off for months. And it really is a unilateral action that I think the Croatian authorities, the Croatian army has undertaken in Sector South by launching attacks in a few areas of Sector South since this morning. The reports have been coming in since this morning, and we've been monitoring it since then.
Vjerovatno su očekivali da tako bude svaki dan. Međutim, mi nismo mogli tako živjeti. Mi smo morali učiniti nešto sami, kad nam već niko nije htio pomoći, da se grad vrati u normalu.
Victims are supposed to get killed. They're supposed to starve and look forlorn in the rain and be muddy and then be grateful when they get a UN package. And God forbid the victim sharpen his stick and fight back and defend his mom or his sister or whatever.
I think this certainly has been quite a setback in terms of the UN efforts.
In 1992, the war spread to Bosnia-Herzegovina, with Milosevic's forces driving to establish a compact Greater Serbian territory, from Serbia through Bosnia and to the Croatian coast. By most accounts, Bosnian Muslims, also known as Bosniaks, got the worst of it during the war in the former Yugoslavia. Approximately 100,000 people were killed in Bosnia, and over 1 million displaced from their homes. At the onset of the war, Croatians and Bosnian Muslims were allied against the Serbs, but in mid-1993 they began fighting each other. This war within a war lasted nearly a year.
Mora se priznati da prvo oružje koje su Bosni dobili, branitelji Bosne i Hercegovine, dolazilo odavde iz Hrvatske. Postoje jedan veliki procenat, prevladavajući procenat ljudi i na jednoj i na drugoj strani, kod Hrvata i kod muslimana, koji su bili protiv tog sukoba i koji su ga smatrali najštetnijom pojavom u ovom cijelom ratu.
You know, at the beginning it was clear that there is one aggressor and that everybody else is a victim. So at the beginning of war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croats and Bosniaks were fighting together. However, unfortunately, with the continuation of war, with the continuation of aggression, there were a number of sporadic incidents among Bosniaks and Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina that some people wanted to use, or better to say, to misuse and to create, atmosphere where Croats and Bosniaks will be divided, and by that actual situation will go in favor of Serbs.
There were a number of reasons, I think, for the war in central Bosnia, and it was a war which essentially benefited the Serbs. One of them was that non-Serbs who were ethnically cleansed, expelled from other areas, particularly Bosanska Krajina, all flooded into central Bosnia.
There was a huge demographic shift within Bosnia as thousands and thousands of Muslims thrown out of their homes elsewhere poured into areas which had actually previously been mixed.
And the delicate ethnic balance there that had prevailed for centuries became disturbed, and people were very hard up against it.
Very bad things were done on both sides. I think that one should look at what happened between the Muslims and the Croats in Bosnia as a kind of madness. It was an appalling time for Croatia, and Croatia lost nearly all of its international support as a result of that.
That was a very difficult time for many of us in Croatian diplomacy, because many of us, not only in diplomacy but in Croatia, we were recognizing in that time that that war is very bad for Croatia, very bad for Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for Bosniak, for everyone.
Mislim da su sve tri strane u sukobu imale svoje interese. Međutim, ti interesi nisu bili toliko prevladavajući da dođe do sukoba između muslimana i Hrvata.
Nažalost, to se dogodilo 1993. godine, ne krivnjom niti Gotovine, niti ostalih časnika.
Cobra served under the command of General Gotovina in a joint Croatian-Bosnian force in the defense of Livno, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Cobra was the commander of the Bosnian unit.
Će ovako do kraja, a to znači dok i ne pobjedimo, a pobijedit ćemo ako Bog da.
Isto kao što su funkcionirali naši sektori, tako je funkcionirao dobro i taj. Znači, muslimanska bojna je imala potpunu autonomiju, s tim da su izravno bili odgovorni direktno generalu Gotovini.
General Gotovina is a very charismatic individual. He's an individual who is multicultural in his worldview. He was very much respected by Bosnian army commanders and was very easily able to come to understandings with them and to lead. Again, to lead not only his own troops, but to lead the Bosnian army as well.
Odnos je bio jednostavno rečeno bratski. Jedna hrana, jedna logistika, sve bilo jedno. Jedan za jedno zapovjedništvo, svi počinjeni generalu Gotovini. I prema tome to nije bilo nikakvi, apsolutno nikakvi trzavica između ta dva naroda.
Clearly, any common sense view was that Croats and Muslims, in general, had to stick together, had to reform an alliance, and had to reverse this wave of Serb aggression.
Mislim da je ovo što se dogodilo išlo na ruku, u cijelosti na ruku agresora, naime, srpskog agresora, velikosrpskog agresora. Nije trebalo doći do toga uopće. Oni su izvukli veliku korist od ovog našeg sukoba.
In March of 1994, the administration of United States President Bill Clinton brokered a political alliance known as the Washington Agreement between the Bosnians and Croatians. Clinton felt that the only way to end the war was for a joint Croatian-Bosnian force to defeat their common enemy, the Serbs.
I think that U.S. role was absolutely crucial in coming to the peace in former Yugoslavia, and the first step in direction of peace is somehow creating a partnership in between Croats and Bosniaks.
Although the Washington Agreement sealed the peace between Croatians and Bosnian Muslims, the Serbs continued to roll through Bosnia with little hope that Europe or the United Nations would stop them.
Oh, is this for the benefit of the television? I explained very clearly to them that there was no cavalry over the hill. There is no international force coming to stop this. That being so, in the absence of discussions and a ceasefire, the killing will go on. And I made that very plain to the President, and I believe he understood it.
The unwillingness of Europe and the UN to intervene to stop the war caused a strong disagreement between the United States and Britain, a rare rift between these two allied nations.
We'd been told by the Europeans for several years, this is in our backyard, this is an EU problem, and so that lasted for 2 or 3 years, including the UN introduction of a protection force that couldn't even protect itself.
The Americans had become thoroughly fed up with the attitude of the Europeans to what was happening. And they could see that neither the European Union nor the United Nations was able to stop this aggression, let alone reverse it. And the obvious proof of that is the terrible fate of the people in Srebrenica.
When I saw the first unit of United Nations peacekeepers with their blue helmets on, we were all crying out of happiness because we thought we were saved. And that's what we believed until the last moment.
During the war, the United Nations set up 6 safe havens in towns throughout Bosnia. One of these was in an eastern Bosnian town called Srebrenica. However, in July of 1995, Srebrenica had fallen to Serb troops, and the area's Muslim population gathered at a UN base run by Dutch troops in nearby potrazi.
I'm witness of the telephone call between Milosevic and Bakashi, special envoy of the Secretary General, in which Milosevic told him and probably nothing would happen.
When the Serbs arrived at the camp, they began separating the women and children from the men. The UN troops stood by and watched as Serbs loaded the women and children onto buses. In the days that followed, Serb forces executed nearly 8,000 of the Bosnian men left behind.
A number of Dutch soldiers witnessed executions right there on the spot. Some of those who were inside the base, like my family, were still safe. At one point, they told us to tell the people inside the base on 13 July 95 that they have to go outside. They said, it's your time to go outside. It's your turn now. I was begging them for several hours to at least keep my brother inside, to at least save my brother's life, if not the life of my parents. And my mother cooked for these people, and they didn't even look at her. You know, it was the same people who ate at our place, and my mother cooked for them. So they simply didn't bother, you know, at all. They were looking the other way. They knew my mother personally, and my mother fainted there on the spot when she realized that our family was going to be killed.
You know, nothing can be the same after genocide. And these guys came here in 1992 and saw the Serbs wipe off an entire group of people from half of the territory of this country and did nothing about it. So what was eventually genocide remained, thanks to the United Nations, a savage civil war in a country where ancient hatreds drove people to kill each other for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is a lie.
There is absolutely no human way to identify who is the aggressor. The fact is that, unfortunately, politicians and propaganda created these images of who is victim, who is aggressor. And the fact is that it was one country.
That's an astounding level of naivete. It was crystal clear who the aggressor was in Belgrade. And so that was the central failure, was the inability to point to the aggressor and say, with moral certitude, you're wrong, and we're the UN, and we're going to put a stop to this.
Really, to speak about civil war, it is totally to ignore the facts. The war started in Slovenia, then moving Croatia, and then continue moving into Bosnia and Herzegovina, and finally to Kosovo. That was not civil war, that was a part of the war, how to create great Serbia.
There was very little agreement as to what to do after the fall of Srebrenica internationally, and within a couple of days there was intensified bombardment on Bihać.
Located in western Bosnia near the border with Croatia, Bihać was another of the 6 safe havens in Bosnia. Just like Srebrenica, it was on the verge of falling, and there were fears in the international community that there would be another massacre. This was confirmed by General Mladic, the architect of the Srebrenica massacre, when he was asked by a Serb journalist in Knin about Bosnian resistance in Bihać.
Gospodine general, da li će muslimani i Bihaća još dugo provocirati srpsku odbranu na području Branića i Gamna?
Hoće sve dok ne budu totalno poraženi kao u Srebrenici.
And if Bihać had fallen, there would have been a humanitarian disaster, at least as bad as Srebrenica.
Da nije bilo Oluje, Bihać bi bio katastrofa.
For more than 3 years now, they've used this advantage, they've enjoyed the green light. Now it's time to show them that the international community will act. It's time to act.
In August of 1995, on the heels of the Srebrenica tragedy, Croatian President Franjo Tuđman appointed General Gotovina to lead Sector South of Operation Storm. The Croatian army, with Bosnian army support, launched the operation to win back the so-called Krajina region, where Serb forces occupied about 25% of Croatia, and to prevent the Bosnian town of Bihać from falling. This was a risky operation because the Serbs were still considered to be the military powerhouse in the war.
The goal of the operation of 1995 was not only to liberate Krajina, it was also to liberate Bihać.
Croatia couldn't survive for a long run being completely divided into two geographical parts. I think Operation Storm was crucial for Croatia to survive as a state.
The Clinton administration had completely endorsed Operation Storm. Clinton makes it perfectly clear in his own memoirs that he was rooting for the Croatians.
It's a small, anecdotal, but seminal event that evidently Hillary Clinton saw the photo, an extraordinarily moving photo of a woman at the refugee camp in Tuzla who hung herself. She was so filled with despair after losing her family and her husband in Srebrenica. She hung herself at the refugee camp, and Hillary Clinton saw that photo and said to Bill, you're the president of the United States of America, this can't go on. So at that point, he went to the Europeans and said, the only language Belgrade understands is force, and we're prepared to back the force.
In his book, My Life, President Clinton wrote that he was rooting for the Croatians in Operation Storm because he felt diplomacy would not take hold until the Serbs sustained serious losses on the ground.
The United States extends its hand in friendship to you. Thank you again for making me feel so welcome.
The U.S. wanted to get Serbs at the negotiating table, so the best way to do that was to show them that they can actually get beaten.
Operation Storm can properly be considered as much an American operation as a Croatian operation. The Pentagon had authorized former American military personnel to give detailed advice and effective training to the Croatian army. So at every stage, at every level, and at every point of time, America was involved. Operation Storm was based on a very clever use of logistics and communications, and the whole operation was successful within 72 hours. Everybody, apart from those in on the secret, was astonished.
There would be no Bosnia today, there would be no Croatia today, there would be no peace today if it weren't for Operation Storm. Operation Storm is the operation that ended the war in Croatia and ultimately ended the war in Bosnia. Those aren't just my words, those are the words of American negotiators who ultimately negotiated the Dayton Peace Treaty that brought peace to Bosnia.
The huge majority of Croats were overwhelmed with the emotion that finally we are controlling our own state, that finally we can live normally.
General Gotovina u hrvatskoj povijesti će sasvim sigurno ostati zapamćen kao čovjek koji je oslobodio više od 10.000 kvadratnih kilometara okupiranog prostora.
committed during the aftermath of Operation Storm.
It was announced today that Croatian General Ante Gotovina has been indicted by the ICTY for command responsibility of Operation Storm.
Of crimes committed by Croatian forces in the aftermath of the operation have put a stain on what could have been Croatia's greatest military.
News of the indictment was met with massive protests. He is charged with 7 counts of murder, persecution, and deportation.
The Storm operation itself was remarkably successful, and one of the reasons it was successful was because there was so little loss of civilian life. Many thousands of Serbs left that area. But what also happened is that those who did not leave, or did not leave in time, were in some cases treated extremely badly, killed, their houses burnt down, injured, intimidated by returning Croat civilians, by some paramilitaries. It was a terrible blot on what had otherwise been a remarkably successful operation.
We never said that Operation Storm was illegal. It was a legal operation, and actually it had a lot of understanding in international community. But one thing is legitimate operation, the other thing is illegitimate, illegal killings and looting. And especially in the aftermath, there were a lot of people killed unlawfully, not in combat, but people were executed who stayed in their homes, who didn't leave Crimea.
In July of 2001, Ante Gotovina was indicted as a war criminal for his command responsibility of Operation Storm.
Gotovina is charged with persecution, deportation, forcible transfer of population, plunder of public property and private property, wanton destruction, murder, inhuman acts and cruel treatment of civilians.
After the ICTY indictment was handed down, Gotovina went on the run. His actions caused considerable controversy, and many questioned Gotovina for not facing a court to prove his innocence.
Definitely after the war, he did brag quite openly about Operation Storm being his baby. And then when it turned out that very, very nasty crimes were committed, I think it should be right that he should claim that responsibility as well, not just pick the glory and the glorious part and leave out the shameful part.
As far as we know, the government simply told Gotovina that there is an indictment against him and whether he will consider to voluntarily surrender, and he just disappeared.
General Gotovina, as a result of the entire process up until that point, felt that it was very questionable as to whether his rights would be protected if he were to appear at the tribunal for trial. No one advised him that an investigation was underway or scheduled an interview between him and the ICTY investigators so that he could tell his side of the story and clear his name before an indictment was brought down. General Gotovina in Operation Storm was only the commander of the southern half of the so-called Krajina region. There was another Croatian general named General Stipetic, who was the commander of the northern half of the so-called Krajina region. Any charge that would apply to General Gotovina, one would think, would apply to General Stipetic as well, because nothing really happened in the south that didn't happen in the north. General Stipetic was given an opportunity to speak with ICTY investigators. 3 months before General Gotovina was indicted, General Stipetic was able to clear his name and any doubts and was never indicted for Operation Storm. General Gotovina never got that chance. And he very much questioned whether he was being made a sacrificial lamb.
Gotovina's lack of faith in the justice system goes beyond the ICTY. Ironically, the very same incident in France that ICTY prosecutors cite to establish his criminal history is what seared Gotovina's mistrust in judicial institutions.
Premier dossier, aucun témoin n'a continué à le mettre en cause une fois qu'il était présent. Le deuxième dossier est un dossier qualifié d'extorsion qui est totalement évanescent puisqu'il a été reconnu par une victime sur une photo qui n'est pas une photo de lui.
General Gotovina is not a fool, and he came to the conclusion that he was not going to get a fair trial. and that is why he absconded.
Gotovina remained a fugitive for over 4 years until his arrest in Tenerife, Spain in December of 2005. It is the argument of ICTY prosecutors that the crimes committed in the aftermath of Storm fall under the responsibility of General Gotovina's command of the operation.
After Operation Storm was completed and after the Croatian army had left the area, you had many thousands of Croatian civilians, many of whom were cleansed from the area in 1991, returning en masse into the area upon seeing the crimes that had been committed against them, the destruction of their own homes, the plunder of their belongings from their own homes. Many took matters into their own hands.
My grandpa's farm was in a small village. When we came back, house was burned to the ground. The other thing, you could see like evidence of shelling it, like from the close. Somebody literally came there with a tank and been hitting the house just for fun. The bull, which was my grandpa's one of favorite animals on a farm, was burned to death in the stables. My grandpa unfortunately died a couple of years after that. He just couldn't bear, you know, everything was basically destroyed. We had to start everything from the beginning.
The revenge which the returning Croatian population took on some Serbs in this Krajina area was of course shocking, and it was of course wrong, but it was also very understandable, because for 4 years the ethnic Croat population of this part of occupied Croatia had been subject themselves to appalling treatment by the leaders of the RSK. And of course, inevitably, by many of their Serb neighbors. In fact, more than 100,000 ethnic Croats left that area over those 4 years.
You cannot really choose one crime to justify another crime. In that case, we really wouldn't need an international or even domestic laws. It's an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, and let the strongest one survive.
I am not guilty for something what happened here. I am not guilty for Vukovar. I am not guilty for Škabrnja. I am not guilty for any possible crime that happened to Croats or to the Serbs. But I know that I was not enough powerful to stop it. And I know that I have to be enough powerful to say I'm sorry for what happened. Because I have to take responsibility for that what someone did on behalf of the name of the people that I belong to.
A sigurno da su osramotili Hrvatsku od tih koji su kasnije pravili zločine. Jer ja kad bi dole išao sa terena natrag, naša bi recimo civila mrtvoga uz cestu koji je ubijen 15 dana posle kad je vojska otišla. Sigurno da su zlo radili s time. I to većino su bili stariji ljudi, ako bi, jer mladi su svi otišli. Ostale nešto stari ljudi tu. I dođe budala i ubije starca.
Čovjek tu, mi smo svjesni da je bilo tog paleža i ubijanja, ne znam točno koliko je bilo, šta je bilo. Ali ja tu Ante, ja ne vjerujem da je Ante pomislio, kao on naredio da se napravi to. Da nema šanse. Čak bi štitio ljude kad bi došlo malo do nečega. Nema šanse.
Uvijek nas je podsjećao na iste stvari, da kad bi mi bili zarobljeni, kako bi željeli da se neprijateljska strana prema nama odnosi i ponaša i to. I u svakoj prilici, prilikom našeg zarobljavanja neprijateljskih vojnika, nam je to uporno ponavljao da imamo jedan humani ljudski odnos, kršćanski.
Gospodin general Gotovina pozvao našega nadbiskupa monsignora Ivana Prenđu da on zapovjednicima govori o etičnosti rata, kako se moraju ponašati za vrijeme rata.
Od tada je prošlo 13 godina. Ja sada mogu pokazati da imam tekst konferencije koju sam održao na poziv generala Gotovine i rekao sam da mi i onda kada branimo dom i domovinu, na što imamo pravo i što je naša moralna, etička obveza, da uvijek treba voditi računa o tome da onaj tko čini zlo i tko mrzi zapravo je najviše pogođen. I mržnja i zlo pogađaju sve ono što on ima, njegovu obitelj, pogađa njegovu sredinu, pogađa njegovu zemlju.
Činjenica je da su ti zločini koji su dogodili poslije Oluje bacili mrlju na cijelu Oluju i da je to sramota za cijelu Hrvatsku, međutim radi se isključivo o pojedincima.
In the first few days of storm, General Gotovina is seen berating his subordinate commanders, telling them that this is how barbarians behave, and insisting that they respect the law and improve their own conduct, or else, he said, if you're not capable of leading men, you will be sent to the front lines as infantry soldiers, and I'll find somebody else to do your job.
Ako ne znate raditi naše zadaće, za oni koji vas niko nije uvukao za kosu da budete šta jeste, onda gospodo izvolite ući u pješadiju i u borbu. Reći ćete ja sam bio, ja sam ratnik, kurče su ratnik. Svaki dan je novi dan ratnika. I svaki dan ratnik se dokaže. A da ne govorim ono što se vidi u gradu. To je sramota. Sramota. Ovo, barbari, vandali rade ovako. Oni koji su plaćeni po ratnom plijenu. I ratuju po ratnom plijenu. Da li je kontaktiran župan, da li si provjerili da li su župani kontaktirani, da li je civilna zaštita zatražena, da li su vatrogasci zatraženi?
Zatraženi su, gospodine.
A di su? Koga vi sramotite? Sami sebe. I one kojima vi zapovjedate za koje odgovarate. A za one naše mrtve poginule koji su ginuli za ovo. Trebate imati malo obraza. Jer za ovaj Knin se gine od Dinare, od ove zime 10. mjeseca. A ne govorim ove zadnje operacije i koliko je njih nastradalo i koliko je još dan danas njih u bolnici i oni koji su trajni invalidi. A vi se ponašate tako, zapovjednici.
I was very angry because as a foreign minister I knew that Croatia would be responsible. But absolutely, Gotovina is not responsible about that.
I tvrdim i garantiram gledajući da sam njegov vojnik, da taj zločin nije napravio. Ko je sve to napravio i kako, ne znam, ali samo znam da je to 100% vojnik, školovan vojnik i znao je svoj posao.
The fact that crimes took place on a widespread level does show a lack of law and order. But there are many situations in history where you have widespread crime being committed in a relatively short period of time. That doesn't necessarily mean it was ordered. The Rodney King riots took place on a widespread basis throughout Los Angeles. It wasn't ordered, though. What happened in New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina? When you had a complete breakdown of law and order, and when civilians start to realize that there is no consequence for their action, you have crime committed on a widespread basis. I would suggest to you the same thing happened in Croatia, and probably on a bigger scale because Croatia, to this day, and particularly at that time, did not have the resources of Los Angeles or New Orleans to be able to just roll in more police officers to address the situation, and particularly since we're talking about 10,500 square kilometers of territory.
I think that if the Croatian prosecutors are able to find enough evidence to gain a conviction against any Croat who mistreated any Serb at that time, then the case should go ahead and should be heard. But the indictment against Gotovina is based wholly on the concept of a joint criminal enterprise to expel the Serb population from Krajina. All of the other crimes and allegations stem from that, and there is no evidence that there was a joint planned criminal enterprise to remove the Serbs from the Krajina. The Serbs left before the Croatian army came, and they were ordered out by their own leaders, by the Serb leaders.
The prosecution in the Milosevic case basically stated that the Croatian Serbs were removed by Milosevic so that he could use them as human flagpoles, so to speak, in marking territory in eastern Bosnia and in Kosovo, where he had cleansed Muslims, and to put Serbs in those places so that he could later say in negotiations that this is now Serb land. In an indictment then of General Gotovina later on, they say no, it was General Gotovina who ethnically cleansed these Serbs from Croatia.
Milosevic was not charged with the deportation of Serbs from Krajina. That was just a background to say that he didn't care about Serbs in Krajina, and just to prove that he had an agreement with Tudjman, general agreement how to deal with Bosnia. It is a fact that Milosevic and Tudjman met, and they had a general agreement how to proceed in this conflicts.
There is not a single person who took part in the negotiating process, whether on behalf of the United States or the European Union, that has said that there was some sort of collusion. There was never any agreement between Tudjman and Milosevic. Milosevic did not see this coming, and any statements to the contrary are simply pure speculation by people who don't have evidence to back up their claims.
The UN's failures are measured in scrapes of earth filled with hundreds of bodies. Their failures are measured in mass graves. The perception on the ground was, now these people are on the other side of Europe judging us, yet when these crimes were going on, they didn't have the wherewithal to stop them. If they can't identify an aggressor after aggression, then they're of no use to a rational world.
ICTY critics charge that the court is being used to further justify the UN's position that all sides were guilty for the war. Defenders of General Gotovina believe that he was indicted because his high ranking serves as a counterbalance to the greater number of Serb leaders that were tried at the court.
Both sides can commit crimes, and we as tribunal, we don't have even jurisdiction over crime of aggression. It was very wise for the international community and Security Council to create a tribunal to deal with individual criminal responsibility and not to deal with this political term aggression.
The product of their work shows something different. The Gotovina indictment specifically names 3 individuals who are deceased. There would be no need to include the names of 3 deceased specifically by name in an indictment unless part of your concern is to create a historical narrative.
Nuremberg has established a narrative that is generally accepted of what had happened during World War II. Rwandan court has also established a narrative of what had happened in Rwanda in April 1994. What's the story of the ICTY? What's the narrative of the ICTY? Oh, everybody committed war crimes. Come on.
Just hours into storm, UN envoy Carl Bildt called a press conference to say that Croatian President Tudjman tried for war crimes because of the operation. Critics contend that this shows the UN's predisposition to view Operation Storm as a criminal enterprise.
Well, I know this statement of Carl Bildt, but international community just suffered a huge setback in Bosnia, where Serbs attacked and took over Srebrenica and Žepa. Maybe he meant that.
It's interesting if you look at Carl Bildt's book, which came out a couple of years afterwards. He has a chapter on Srebrenica and a chapter on Operation Storm. And he doesn't, at any point that I can recall, refer to Srebrenica as a genocide or anything approaching, whereas ethnic cleansing is very much emphasized when he's referring to Operation Storm.
Canadian UN General Andrew Leslie told the BBC that essentially every large urban center in Caneen had been hit by shellfire.
When reporters from the New York Times and New York Newsday and the international press came in to see this new Dresden of Croatia, so to speak, they quite quickly realized that nothing of any significance had happened.
During Operation Storm, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Roy Gutman reported in Newsday that a UN spokesperson had alleged at a press conference that Croatia had deliberately shelled the civilian hospital in Caneen.
Mogu reći da bolnica nije, nikakva šteta na bolnici nije učinjena, baš ništa. Ja mislim da čak niti jedan metak nije u bolnicu ispaljen. Dakle, bolnica je bila potpuno u redu. potpuno intaktna.
In later reports, a fellow UN officer alleged that General Leslie asked him, illegally, to find proof that the Croatian military had committed crimes. Leslie denies this was illegal.
This operation became a crime as soon as it was launched because the international community was biased. All sides were to be guilty. And it started that way, it finished that way, and it goes on with the International Court in La Haye.
ICTY has a major problem. It was established by the United Nations. And by the time it was established, United Nations were deeply, deeply discredited. United Nations has never reckoned with what it has done in Bosnia and Herzegovina, what it has done with in Croatia as well. And I think that unless there is a reckoning, the United Nations will not have the moral credibility that it needs to be a constructive force in the world.
General Gotovina was not even in the area when the crimes that are being discussed were committed.
Kad se akcija Oluja završila, general Gotovina sa svojom postrojbama je išao u Bosnu nastaviti dalje operacije.
So the Croatian army had to set up a new front line inside of Bosnia in the immediate aftermath of storm. Once the front line had been established, General Gotovina and the Croatian army, in consultation with the United States, launched new offensive operations in Bosnia to liberate Western Bosnia and to force Milosevic to agree to come to Dayton to negotiate a peace deal.
Gotovina is the scapegoat. He is a scapegoat politically, and of course he is a scapegoat judicially, but in this case the judicial process is just really following political requirements.
Okay, so here's the last question. Is peace possible between Croats and Serbs?
I think that everything that is happening in Croatia after 90s is proving that not only that peace is possible, peace is already here.
We've had peace between Croats and Serbs for the past 10 years, and I expect it will continue.
Ja vam mogu reći da ja živim ovdje 12 godina, nikad od nikoga nisam doživio niti nikako ružnu riječ.
U našem mjestu ovdje u Numči je već taj mir. Od prvog dana, ne samo sad.
Više smo se mi bojali daljni nego ovi sela iz mjesta našega. Bežali smo po šumama, bežali smo k njima, išli smo isto k njima ovdje susjedim koji su nam bili bliži. I spavali kod njih sve. A oni svoji bili s nama, oni su dolazili k nam, čuvali nas i onda čuvali stražu da ne bi nas ko napao i to.
Dok ovi naši domaći iz sela, radilo se recimo od jednog većeme postotku ljudi koji su bili lojalni, oni su bili surađivali, čak kao što čujete od njih da su ispavali kod njih, pazili su da se nešto ne dogodi.
Dolaziti, mi smo normalno pomagali jedno druge dolazili su spavati ovdje, odmarali su. Ja sam rekao budite ovdje po noći.
Čujte, mi uvijek imamo jedan te isti pogled jedni na druge. Bili smo dobri, ostajemo dobri. Pomoćemo jedan drugom koliko možemo.
I to se proteže i dan danas. Uopšte nemamo nikakve mržnje, ni s kim, niti oni s nami, niti mi s njima. Znači, kao da nije rat bio nikada. I ja kad sam došla 98. godine, meni su pomogli svi Hrvati moji, ne sada imenom nikoga, nego svi. Ja još nisam imao nikakve problema sa mojim komšijama, ni dalje, bio sam u Zadar, Šibenik, Split, Zagreb, nikada ja nisam imao problema ni s kim.
Nacionalizam može biti ljubav prema domovini, a može biti i fašizam. Moramo fair pogledati, a nikakva mržnja prema čovjeku. Svaki čovjek ima pravo na život. Da li on bio Srbin ili Hrvat?